There are moments in life that split your world into before and after. Moments so sharp, so unexpected, that they slice through everything you thought you knew about yourself and the people you love. For me, that moment happened on what was supposed to be the happiest day of my life, standing in a white dress in front of 200 people, when the man I was about to marry raised his hand and struck me across the face. The sound echoed through the chapel like a gunshot. The gasps that followed seemed to suck all the oxygen from the room. But what happened next, what I did in the 60 seconds that followed, didn't just end our wedding. It ended him in ways he never saw coming. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Claire Donovan, and 6 months ago, I was planning the wedding of my dreams to a man I thought I knew inside and out. Derek Hartman was everything I thought I wanted. Successful, charming, the kind of man who could work a room with nothing but a smile and a firm handshake. We met 4 years earlier at a fundraising gala for the children's hospital where I worked as a pediatric nurse. He was there representing his tech startup, some kind of medical software company that promised to revolutionize patient care coordination. I remember being impressed by how passionate he seemed about making a difference, about using technology to help people instead of just making money. Our courtship was a whirlwind. Derek had this way of making you feel like you were the only person in the world when he focused his attention on you. 3 months after we met, he surprised me with a weekend trip to wine country. 6 months in, he had a key to my apartment. By our first anniversary, we were talking about forever. When he proposed 2 years into our relationship, down on one knee at the same gala where we first met, I didn't hesitate. I said yes with tears streaming down my face, convinced that I had found my person, my partner, the man I would build a life with. The engagement period was long, almost 18 months, but that was mainly because of Derek's work schedule. His company was expanding rapidly, and he was constantly traveling, meeting with investors, closing deals, building what he called our future. I threw myself into wedding planning with the kind of enthusiasm that probably annoyed everyone around me. I spent hours scrolling through Pinterest boards, visiting venues, tasting cakes, choosing flowers. My best friend Lauren, who had known me since nursing school, joked that I had become a wedding planning robot, but she said it with love in her eyes as she helped me address invitations at my kitchen table. There were small things that bothered me during those months, little moments that I told myself didn't matter in the grand scheme of things. Derek could be dismissive when he was stressed, brushing off my opinions about the wedding with a wave of his hand and a comment about how I should just handle it since he was too busy. He had a temper that occasionally flared up, usually when things didn't go his way, sharp words that cut but were always followed by apologies and flowers. His friends, a group of guys he had known since college, seemed to bring out a different side of him, more arrogant, more crude. But I convinced myself these were minor flaws, the kind of imperfections everyone has, nothing that changed the fundamental truth that we loved each other. The week before the wedding, things shifted in a way I couldn't quite put my finger on. Derek seemed distracted, constantly on his phone, snapping at me over small things like the seating chart or the song selection for our first dance. When I tried to talk to him about it, asking if he was having second thoughts or if something was wrong with work, he told me I was being paranoid and creating problems where none existed. He said I was turning into a bridezilla, that I needed to relax and trust that everything would be perfect. So I swallowed my concerns and focused on the final details, convincing myself that he was just feeling the normal pre-wedding jitters that everyone experiences. The morning of the wedding arrived with perfect blue skies and warm September sunshine. I woke up in the bridal suite at the Rosewood Manor, a historic estate we had rented for the ceremony and reception. Lauren was already awake, laying out my dress and veil with the kind of care usually reserved for museum artifacts. My sister Hannah arrived with coffee and pastries, and my mother swept in shortly after with the hairstylist and makeup artist in tow. It should have been magical. In many ways, it was. We laughed and took photos and I tried on my dress for the final time, watching myself transform in the mirror into someone who looked like a bride from a magazine. But there was this knot in my stomach that wouldn't go away, this sense of unease that I kept trying to push down. I told myself it was normal nervousness, that every bride feels this way on her wedding day. Lauren noticed, though. She pulled me aside while the makeup artist was touching up my mother's lipstick and asked me point blank if I was sure about this. I remember looking at her, at the genuine concern in her eyes, and almost saying something. Almost admitting that I had doubts, that something felt off, that Derek had seemed different lately. But then Hannah called out that it was time for photos, and the moment passed. I smiled at Lauren and told her I was just being silly, that of course I was sure. She nodded, but I could see she wasn't entirely convinced. The ceremony was scheduled for 3 in the afternoon in the estate's chapel, a beautiful stone building with stained glass windows that cast colored light across the pews. As I stood in the bridal room waiting for my cue to walk down the aisle, I could hear the string quartet playing and the murmur of guests settling into their seats. My father appeared in his tuxedo, looking handsome and proud, offering me his arm. He told me I looked beautiful, that he was so happy for me, that Derek was a lucky man. I held on to his arm perhaps a bit too tightly as we made our way to the chapel entrance. The doors opened, and everyone stood and turned to look at me. The traditional wedding march began, and I started my walk down the aisle, focusing on Derek standing at the altar in his perfectly tailored tuxedo. He looked good, objectively handsome with his dark hair styled just right and that confident smile on his face. But as I got closer, I noticed something in his expression, something tight around his eyes, a tension in his jaw. His best man Marcus stood beside him, along with 2 other groomsmen I had met only a handful of times. They all wore the same expensive suits, the same slicked back hair, the same aura of self-satisfaction. I reached the altar, and my father kissed my cheek before placing my hand in Derek's. His palm was sweaty, I remember noticing that. The officiant, a family friend who had known Derek since childhood, began the ceremony with the traditional words about marriage being a sacred bond, a commitment before God and these witnesses. I tried to focus on the words, on the meaning of what we were about to do, but I kept getting distracted by Derek's face. He wasn't looking at me with love or joy or even nervousness. He looked angry. Actually angry, like I had done something to offend him just by walking down the aisle. We got through the opening remarks and the first reading without incident. When it came time for the vows, I went first, speaking from the heart about love and partnership and building a life together. I had written them myself, spent hours getting every word right, and I delivered them looking into Derek's eyes, trying to see the man I had fallen in love with 4 years earlier. He barely seemed to be listening. When it was his turn, he pulled out a piece of paper and read words that sounded generic and impersonal, like he had copied them from a website the night before. I told myself it didn't matter, that some people just weren't good at public speaking, that the words weren't as important as the commitment itself. Then came the moment for the rings. The officiant asked if anyone had any reason why we should not be joined in marriage, and of course, no one spoke. It's mostly a formality, that question, a tradition that rarely results in actual objections. But in that pause, in that brief silence, I saw Derek's expression change. Something dark flickered across his face, something cold and cruel that I had never seen before. He turned to Marcus, and they exchanged a look that I couldn't interpret but that made my skin prickle with warning. The officiant continued, asking Derek if he took me to be his lawfully wedded wife. Derek opened his mouth to speak, and I waited for the words "I do," the 2 simple words that would change everything. Instead, he said, "Actually, I need to say something first." The chapel went completely silent. Even the officiant looked confused, glancing down at his notes as if he had missed a section. I stood there frozen, bouquet in my hands, staring at Derek with a mixture of confusion and growing dread. He turned to face the congregation, 200 people sitting in those pews, friends and family who had traveled from all over to be here for this moment. "I think everyone should know," Derek said, his voice carrying through the chapel with perfect clarity, "that my bride here isn't exactly the innocent angel she pretends to be." The words hung in the air like poison. I couldn't process what was happening, couldn't understand why Derek was saying this, what he could possibly mean. My brain struggled to catch up with the moment, and all I could manage was a whispered, "What are you talking about?" He turned back to me, and the look on his face was pure venom. "Don't play dumb, Claire. I know about the messages. I know about your little emotional affair with that doctor at your hospital." The accusation hit me like a physical blow. I actually stumbled backward a step, nearly tripping over the hem of my dress. "That's insane," I said, my voice shaking. "I have never, ever cheated on you or even thought about it." "What are you talking about?" There was a doctor at the hospital, Dr. Nathan Cole, who I worked with regularly on the pediatric ward. We were friends, nothing more. We grabbed coffee sometimes in the cafeteria, texted occasionally about patients or scheduling issues. It was completely professional, completely innocent. I had even introduced Derek to Nathan at a hospital event months earlier, and there had been no issues, no jealousy, nothing to suggest Derek had any problem with our friendship. "The messages I found on your phone," Derek continued, and I realized with horror that Marcus and the other groomsmen were smirking, like this was all part of some planned performance. "All those late-night texts, those inside jokes, the way you talk to him. You think I'm stupid? You think I don't know what that means? You went through my phone?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Derek, Nathan is a colleague. A friend. There is absolutely nothing inappropriate in those messages because there is nothing inappropriate happening. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "You're making something out of nothing." "Am I?" He took a step closer to me, and I could see fury in his eyes. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like I'm about to marry someone who doesn't respect me, who makes me look like a fool in front of my friends." That's when it clicked. This wasn't about Nathan Cole or any messages. This was about Derek's ego, about his need for control, about something festering inside him that had probably been there all along but that I had refused to see. I could hear people shifting in their seats, confused murmurs rippling through the congregation. My mother had half risen from her seat, my father's hand on her arm holding her back. Lauren was standing up in the front row, her face pale with shock. "Derek," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, trying to salvage something from this nightmare, "I don't know why you're doing this, but if you have concerns about my friendship with Nathan, we can talk about it. Later. In private. This isn't the time or place for this conversation." "No?" He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "When is the right time, Claire? When were you planning to tell me the truth? Or were you just going to keep lying to my face while you carried on your little romance?" "There is no romance." My voice broke, frustration and humiliation warring inside me. "You're being paranoid and irrational, and you're doing it in front of everyone we know. Please, can we just talk about this somewhere private?" That's when everything went from bad to catastrophic. Derek's hand shot out, and before I could even process what was happening, his palm connected with my cheek with enough force to snap my head to the side. The slap echoed through the chapel, sharp and unmistakable. For a moment, time seemed to stop. I stood there, my hand slowly rising to touch my stinging face, my mind unable to process that Derek had just hit me. At our wedding. In front of 200 witnesses. The chapel erupted. People were shouting, standing up, my father was pushing past people trying to get to the altar. Lauren was screaming Derek's name, and I could hear my mother crying. But I barely registered any of it because I was staring at Derek, at this man I had thought I knew, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time. He wasn't sorry. He wasn't horrified by what he had just done. If anything, he looked satisfied, like he had finally put me in my place, finally shown everyone who was really in control. Something inside me, something that had been bending under the weight of this relationship for months or maybe years, finally snapped. Not broke, but snapped into place, aligned with a clarity I had never experienced before. Not just for me, but for every woman who had ever been hit by a partner, for everyone who had ever been humiliated or controlled or made to feel small by someone who claimed to love them. "Do it," I said, my voice hoarse but firm. "Press charges. I want him held accountable for what he did." The hours that followed were a blur of activity that felt surreal and disconnected from reality. While I sat in the bridal room still wearing my wedding dress, my father and his lawyer friend Richard were already setting things in motion. The two police officers who had been guests took formal statements, photographing the red mark on my cheek that was already starting to bruise. At least 7 people had recorded the incident on their phones, and Richard was collecting copies of every video as evidence. What Derek had done wasn't just witnessed, it was documented from multiple angles with perfect clarity. Lauren helped me out of my dress with gentle hands, careful not to damage the fabric even though I told her I never wanted to see it again. She had brought clothes from my overnight bag, simple jeans and a sweater that felt like armor compared to the delicate lace and silk I had been wearing. As I changed, I caught glimpses of myself in the mirror, seeing a stranger with smudged makeup and wild hair, a woman whose entire life had shifted in the span of 30 minutes. Hannah was on her phone, her voice sharp and efficient as she spoke to the vendors. The reception was supposed to start in 2 hours, a lavish dinner and dance that had cost more than my car. She was canceling everything, dealing with the logistical nightmare while I sat there feeling numb and disconnected. The caterers, the DJ, the photographer who had been capturing what was supposed to be the beginning of my happily ever after. All of it had to be undone, unwound, erased. My mother hadn't stopped crying since we left the chapel. She kept apologizing, as if she should have somehow known this would happen, as if she could have prevented it. I held her hand and told her it wasn't her fault, that none of us could have predicted Derek would do something so violent and public. But I could see in her eyes that she was replaying every interaction she had ever had with him, looking for warning signs she had missed, red flags she should have noticed. Richard came into the bridal room with his briefcase, all business despite the emotional chaos around him. He sat down across from me and explained the process with the kind of calm professionalism that made me understand why my father trusted him with important matters. We would file assault charges immediately. The video evidence was overwhelming, and with 200 witnesses including multiple law enforcement officers, the case was essentially open and shut. Derek would likely be arrested within the next few hours. But Richard wanted to discuss something else, something I hadn't even thought about in the chaos. Derek's company had been doing well, very well according to the financial disclosures we had done as part of our pre-wedding planning. We had signed a prenuptial agreement at Derek's insistence, something that had stung at the time but that I had agreed to because I loved him and wanted him to feel secure. That prenup was now meaningless since we had never actually gotten married, but Richard pointed out that I might have grounds for a civil suit beyond the criminal charges. Emotional distress, public humiliation, defamation of character based on his false accusations about Nathan. The costs associated with the wedding that would now go to waste. It could add up to a significant amount, and Richard believed any jury would be sympathetic given the circumstances. I told him I would think about it, that right now I just wanted Derek held accountable for hitting me, that the money felt secondary to making sure he faced real consequences for his actions. As evening approached, words started spreading beyond the people who had been at the chapel. My phone was exploding with calls and texts from friends who had heard what happened, expressing shock and support and disbelief. Social media was apparently on fire with the story, though I couldn't bring myself to look. Someone had already posted one of the videos, and it was spreading rapidly, being shared and commented on thousands of times. Derek's name was trending, and not in a good way. My father came back into the room looking grim but satisfied. Derek had been arrested at the estate, still in his tuxedo, led away in handcuffs while the remaining guests watched. Marcus and the other groomsmen had apparently scattered as soon as they realized the police were involved, but their participation in whatever Derek had planned was also documented on video. Richard was looking into whether they could face any charges as accessories, though he admitted that was a long shot. We left the Rosewood Manor as the sun was setting, the golden light making the whole scene feel even more surreal. The estate that should have been filled with celebration and dancing was instead crawling with police and upset vendors trying to pack up their unused supplies. I saw the wedding cake as we walked to the car, a towering 5-tier masterpiece covered in sugar flowers that I had spent hours designing with the baker. It sat abandoned on a table, a monument to everything that had fallen apart. My parents insisted I come home with them, back to the house where I had grown up, and I was too exhausted to argue. Lauren and Hannah came too, nobody wanting to leave me alone. We sat in the living room where I had played as a child, where I had brought Derek to meet my parents for the first time, where we had told everyone about our engagement. My mother made tea that nobody drank, and we all sat there in silence, still trying to process what had happened. The next morning arrived too quickly and felt entirely too normal. The sun rose just like it always did. Birds sang outside the window. The world kept turning as if nothing had changed, even though my entire existence felt like it had been shattered and reassembled into something unrecognizable. I woke up on the couch where I had finally fallen asleep around 3 in the morning, still wearing the clothes Lauren had helped me into, my face sore and swollen where Derek had hit me. My phone showed hundreds of missed calls and texts. I scrolled through them mechanically, seeing names of people I hadn't talked to in years, all reaching out with variations of the same message. They were sorry, they were shocked, they wanted to know if I was okay, they had seen the video. That last part kept coming up. The video had gone viral overnight, viewed millions of times, shared across every social media platform. Derek's name wasn't just trending anymore, it was everywhere, associated with words like abuser and assault and wedding disaster. Lauren appeared with coffee and sat down next to me. She had stayed the entire night, sleeping in the armchair, making sure I wasn't alone. She looked exhausted but alert, her phone also showing the aftermath of our nightmare. She showed me some of the news articles that had picked up the story. Local news had turned into regional coverage, and now national outlets were reporting on the groom who assaulted his bride at the altar. Some had tracked down details about Derek's company, about his background, painting a picture of a successful businessman with a dark side. What surprised me most was the response from people who knew Derek professionally. His business partners, his clients, people who had worked with him over the years. Some were coming forward with their own stories of his temper, his arrogance, incidents where he had been verbally abusive or threatening. It was like the floodgates had opened, and suddenly people felt safe speaking up about behavior they had witnessed or experienced but had kept quiet about. The perfect image Derek had cultivated was cracking apart, revealing something ugly underneath. My father came downstairs with more news. Derek had been released on bail early that morning, but there were conditions. He was not allowed to contact me directly or indirectly, had to surrender his passport, and had a court date set for the following month. Richard had already filed the civil suit, and Derek's lawyers had apparently been calling non-stop trying to negotiate a settlement. My father's expression made it clear what he thought about that idea. I spent the day in a strange limbo, watching my life become a public spectacle while hiding in my childhood bedroom. Friends stopped by with food and flowers and condolences like someone had died. In a way, someone had. The Claire who had walked down that aisle believing she was about to marry the love of her life was gone, replaced by someone harder, angrier, more aware of the darkness that could hide behind a charming smile. By the third day, I knew I couldn't hide forever. I had to go back to my apartment, face my actual life, figure out what came next. Lauren drove me, staying close as we climbed the stairs to the third-floor unit I had been so excited to leave behind for the house Derek and I had picked out together. That house, the one we were supposed to move into after the honeymoon, was another complication Richard was handling. Derek's name was on the deed, but I had contributed to the down payment. It was another mess to untangle from the wreckage of our relationship. My apartment felt both familiar and foreign. Nothing had changed physically, but everything felt different. I had packed up most of my belongings in preparation for the move, and now those boxes sat stacked in the corner, a reminder of a future that would never happen. Lauren helped me unpack, putting books back on shelves and clothes back in drawers, trying to restore some sense of normalcy to the space. The hospital called that afternoon. My supervisor, a kind woman named Patricia who had always supported me, wanted to know when I would be ready to come back to work. I had requested 2 weeks off for the wedding and honeymoon, and technically I still had that time available. But she also wanted me to know that HR had been made aware of the situation, and if I needed additional time or support, they would work with me. She also mentioned, her voice careful, that Dr. Nathan Cole had heard about Derek's accusations and wanted me to know he was willing to provide a statement if needed, making it clear that our professional relationship had never been anything inappropriate. That detail, Derek's false accusation about Nathan, felt almost forgotten in the chaos of everything else. But it bothered me more as I had time to think about it. Derek hadn't just hit me. He had tried to destroy my reputation first, to justify his violence by painting me as unfaithful, to make himself the victim of my supposed betrayal. It was calculated and cruel in a way that made me question everything I thought I knew about him. I started going through our shared digital life, the social media accounts and photo albums and shared documents. There were pictures of us looking happy, captions about love and forever, comments from friends congratulating us on finding each other. I deleted them all methodically, erasing the digital footprint of our relationship one post at a time. With each deletion, I felt a little bit lighter, a little bit more in control. Lauren ordered takeout, and we ate sitting on my living room floor surrounded by half-unpacked boxes. She told me about the gossip circulating in our friend group, who was supporting me, who was staying suspiciously quiet, who had apparently been friends with Derek longer than I realized and were struggling with the cognitive dissonance of what he had done. She also told me that Marcus had posted some kind of defensive statement on social media, claiming he had no idea Derek was going to hit me, that he thought Derek was just going to call off the wedding. It rang hollow, and the comments on his post reflected that. As the days turned into a week, I started to find my footing again. The shock and numbness began to fade, replaced by a clarity I had never experienced before. I had been living my life according to what I thought I should want, following a script written by society and expectations and fear of being alone. Derek had been part of that script, the successful husband, the big wedding, the picture-perfect life. But none of it had been real. Or rather, it had been real only in the sense that I had convinced myself it was what I wanted. I returned to work after the week ended, walking into the hospital with my head held high despite knowing that everyone had heard what happened. The response from my colleagues was overwhelming in its kindness. Nurses I barely knew stopped me in the hallways to offer support. Doctors I had worked with for years told me they were proud of how I had handled the situation. Even patients' families, some of whom had somehow heard about the viral video, expressed their sympathy and admiration. Dr. Nathan Cole found me in the break room on my second day back. He looked uncomfortable but determined as he sat down across from me. He apologized for Derek's accusations, even though he had nothing to apologize for. He said he felt guilty that his friendship with me had somehow been twisted into ammunition against me. I assured him that Derek's behavior wasn't his responsibility, that the accusations said everything about Derek and nothing about either of us. We agreed to continue our professional relationship exactly as it had always been, refusing to let Derek's paranoia and cruelty change how we interacted. The court date approached faster than I expected. Richard prepared me extensively, explaining what would happen, what questions I might face, how to present myself. The assault charge was straightforward given the overwhelming evidence, but Derek's lawyers were apparently trying to negotiate some kind of plea deal that would avoid jail time. Richard was pushing back hard, arguing that the public nature of the assault and Derek's complete lack of remorse warranted serious consequences. I had to give a victim impact statement, something I had never thought I would need to do. Writing it forced me to confront the full scope of what Derek had done, not just the physical violence but the emotional manipulation that had preceded it, the way he had tried to destroy my character before hitting me, the public humiliation he had inflicted. I wrote about the nightmares I was having, the way I flinched now when people moved too quickly, the difficulty trusting my own judgment after being so wrong about someone I thought I knew completely. The day of the hearing arrived, and I walked into the courthouse with my parents and Lauren flanking me. The building was crawling with reporters, cameras pointed at anyone who entered or exited. Derek's case had become a symbol of something larger, a conversation about domestic violence and toxic masculinity and the dangers of men who saw women as possessions to be controlled. I hadn't asked for that role, hadn't wanted to become a public figure, but it seemed I didn't have a choice. Derek was already inside with his lawyers, expensive suits and practiced expressions of concern. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of public opinion and legal consequences. Our eyes met briefly across the courtroom, and I saw something in his face that might have been regret but looked more like resentment, anger that I had dared to fight back instead of accepting his abuse quietly. The hearing proceeded with formal efficiency. The prosecutor presented the evidence, playing the video that had been seen by millions. Watching it again, seeing Derek's hand connect with my face from multiple angles, hearing the gasps of the congregation, it all felt both distant and immediate. The judge watched with an expression that grew increasingly stern, occasionally making notes, asking pointed questions about Derek's history and character. When it was my turn to speak, I stood up on shaking legs and read my victim impact statement. I talked about the fear I now carried with me, the way Derek had shattered my sense of safety and security. I talked about the professional impact, how his false accusations about Dr. Cole could have damaged my career and reputation. I talked about the emotional toll of having such a private moment of violence broadcast to the world, becoming a viral video rather than something I could process privately. I also talked about why I was pursuing this case so aggressively. It wasn't about revenge or bitterness. It was about accountability. It was about making sure Derek understood that violence against women had real consequences, that he couldn't charm or buy his way out of what he had done. And it was about sending a message to other women in similar situations that they didn't have to accept abuse, that they had the right to demand justice and respect. Derek's lawyer tried to paint his client in a sympathetic light, talking about the stress he had been under, the pressure of running a company, suggesting that the incident was an aberration rather than a pattern. But the prosecutor countered with testimony from former employees and business associates, people who described Derek's temper and controlling behavior, incidents that established a history of aggression even if it had never been physical before. The judge took a recess to consider the evidence and arguments. We waited in a small conference room, the minutes stretching into hours. Richard tried to prepare me for various outcomes, explaining that assault convictions could result in anything from probation to jail time depending on numerous factors. He thought we had a strong case, but cautioned that the legal system didn't always deliver the justice victims hoped for. When we were called back into the courtroom, the atmosphere felt electric with tension. The judge entered, and we all stood, then sat again as instructed. He looked at Derek for a long moment before speaking, and what he said changed everything. Guilty on all charges. Derek would serve 6 months in jail followed by 2 years of probation. He would be required to attend anger management and domestic violence counseling. He would have a permanent criminal record as a convicted abuser. And he was ordered to pay restitution covering the costs of the wedding and my legal fees. I watched Derek's face crumble as the sentence was read. His lawyers immediately started talking about appeals, but the judge cut them off sharply. The evidence was overwhelming, the crime was committed in front of hundreds of witnesses, and Derek had shown no genuine remorse. The sentence would stand. Court officers moved forward to take Derek into custody, and as he was led away in handcuffs for the second time, he looked back at me with pure hatred in his eyes. I should have felt triumphant. Justice had been served. Derek was going to jail. His reputation was destroyed. Everything I had wanted in terms of accountability had happened. But instead, I just felt tired and empty, drained by months of stress and trauma and legal proceedings. Lauren hugged me tight, and my parents both had tears in their eyes, but I couldn't quite access the emotions everyone seemed to expect from me. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed us asking for statements. Richard had prepared me for this, and I had a brief comment ready. I thanked the court for taking the case seriously, expressed hope that my experience would encourage other victims of domestic violence to come forward, and emphasized that no one should ever accept abuse from a partner. It was measured and appropriate, and it would be quoted in dozens of articles over the next few days. The civil suit settled 2 weeks later. Derek's lawyers wanted to avoid another trial, another round of publicity, another opportunity for the world to be reminded of what their client had done. The settlement amount was substantial, more than enough to cover the wedding costs and provide a financial cushion while I figured out my next steps. Richard negotiated hard, making sure Derek's company and not just Derek personally was liable, ensuring that the money would actually be paid rather than disappearing into bankruptcy protection. I donated a significant portion of the settlement to domestic violence organizations, wanting something positive to come from the nightmare I had lived through. The rest I put into savings, a security fund that represented my independence and ability to build a life on my own terms. It felt important not to keep all the money, not to let Derek's violence become my windfall. I wanted to transform what he had done into something that helped others. The months following the settlement brought an unexpected peace that felt almost unsettling after so much chaos. I threw myself into work with renewed focus, taking on extra shifts at the hospital and volunteering for the more challenging cases. The pediatric ward became my sanctuary, a place where my problems felt small compared to the battles these children were fighting. There was something healing about being needed, about using my skills to make a tangible difference in someone else's life when my own had felt so out of control. My apartment slowly transformed from the space I had been preparing to leave into a home that felt authentically mine. I painted the walls a soft sage green that Derek would have hated, bought furniture that suited my taste rather than his preference for stark modern lines, filled the shelves with books and plants and photographs of people who actually mattered to me. Lauren helped me hang artwork one Saturday afternoon, and we stood back admiring a collection of vintage botanical prints that made the whole space feel warm and alive. The social fallout from the wedding continued to ripple outward in ways I hadn't anticipated. Some friends revealed themselves to be exactly who I needed in my life, showing up with coffee and company, respecting when I needed space and being there when I needed support. Others disappeared quietly, unable to handle the messiness of what had happened or perhaps uncomfortable with the public nature of my situation. I learned to let them go without bitterness, understanding that not everyone was equipped to stand beside someone going through trauma. Derek's company imploded within 3 months of his conviction. The board of directors forced him out, trying to distance the organization from their founder's criminal behavior, but the damage was irreversible. Clients withdrew contracts, investors pulled funding, and key employees resigned rather than be associated with someone convicted of assault. The tech startup that Derek had spent years building collapsed under the weight of his actions, and while I took no pleasure in watching his professional life disintegrate, I couldn't deny a certain satisfaction in seeing consequences extend beyond just the legal system. Marcus reached out to me in an unexpected email 4 months after the courthouse scene. His message was long and rambling, full of apologies and attempts to explain his role in what happened. He claimed he had thought Derek was just going to call off the wedding dramatically, make some speech about his doubts, maybe embarrass me a little. He swore he had no idea Derek would become violent, that he had been horrified when it happened. He said watching the videos afterward, seeing himself smirk in the background while Derek raised his hand to me, had made him sick with shame. I read his email 3 times, trying to decide how I felt about his apology. Part of me wanted to believe him, to accept that he had been swept up in Derek's toxic energy without fully understanding where it would lead. But another part of me, the part that had grown harder and more skeptical through this experience, couldn't forget that Marcus had been complicit in planning to humiliate me. Even if he hadn't anticipated violence, he had been willing to participate in cruelty. I deleted the email without responding, deciding that some bridges were better left burned. Lauren convinced me to start seeing a therapist, and I found myself in the office of Dr. Patricia Wells every Tuesday evening. At first, I resisted the process, convinced that I was handling everything fine on my own. But Patricia had a way of asking questions that revealed the cracks in my armor, the places where I was still bleeding that I had pretended were healed. We talked about trauma and trust, about the insidious nature of emotional abuse that preceded physical violence, about how Derek had likely been conditioning me for years before that slap. Through therapy, I began to see patterns I had missed while living them. The way Derek had isolated me from certain friends he deemed too independent or outspoken. How he had slowly eroded my confidence by questioning my decisions and making me second-guess my instincts. The financial control masked as being responsible with money. The jealousy disguised as caring about my safety. All of it had been building towards something, and if the wedding hadn't happened, if he hadn't revealed himself so spectacularly and publicly, I might have ended up married to someone who would have made my life a quiet nightmare. Patricia helped me understand that what Derek did at the altar, while shocking to everyone else, was actually the most honest moment of our entire relationship. The mask had slipped completely, revealing the person who had always been underneath the charm and success and romantic gestures. In some ways, I was lucky that it happened when and how it did, witnessed by hundreds of people, documented on video. Women in abusive relationships often had no proof, no witnesses, no one to believe them. My trauma had been public, but so had the accountability. I started attending a support group for domestic violence survivors that met every Thursday at a community center downtown. Walking into that first meeting felt terrifying, like I was admitting to being a victim, a label I struggled with accepting. But the women in that circle understood things that no one else could. They knew the shame and confusion and anger. They knew what it felt like to love someone who hurt you. They knew the complicated grief of mourning a relationship with someone who was still alive but lost to you forever. Through their stories, I learned that abuse takes countless forms and follows patterns that felt disturbingly familiar. The love bombing phase where everything is perfect and intense. The slow introduction of control and criticism. The isolation from support systems. The incidents that get explained away or blamed on stress or external factors. The apologies that seem genuine until they happen again. And finally, the moment where the mask drops completely and you see who they really are, often when you try to leave or assert independence. One woman named Patricia, who had been attending the group for 2 years, told me something that shifted my entire perspective. She said that healing wasn't about getting back to who I was before Derek, it was about becoming someone new, someone stronger and wiser who carried the experience without letting it define her entirely. I didn't need to erase what happened or pretend it didn't leave scars. I needed to integrate it into my story as a chapter that taught me crucial things about myself and the world, even though I would never have chosen to learn them this way. My relationship with my family deepened in unexpected ways. My father, who had always been somewhat reserved with his emotions, became protective and openly affectionate in a way he hadn't been since I was a child. He checked in on me daily, helped me with practical tasks around my apartment, and made sure I knew that I would always have a home with them if I needed it. We talked about his own regrets regarding Derek, signs he felt he should have noticed, questions he wished he had asked. I reassured him that none of us could have predicted Derek's violence, that abusers are skilled at hiding their true nature. My mother channeled her emotions into action, volunteering at a women's shelter and becoming an advocate for domestic violence awareness in our community. She gave talks at local organizations about recognizing warning signs in relationships, using my story with my permission as an example of how abuse can hide behind a facade of success and normalcy. Watching her transform her pain into purpose inspired me to consider how I might do the same eventually, though I wasn't quite ready yet. Hannah, my sister, became one of my closest confidants in ways she hadn't been before. She was younger by 4 years, and we had always been close but not especially intimate with our inner lives. After the wedding, she opened up about her own relationship struggles, fears about dating, concerns about trusting her judgment with men. We talked for hours about how women are conditioned to ignore their instincts, to prioritize being nice over being safe, to give second chances even when first impressions scream danger. Our shared processing of these issues created a bond between us that felt unbreakable. The hospital became not just my workplace but my community. The nurses I worked with created an informal network of support, making sure I was never completely alone, inviting me to dinners and movie nights and weekend hikes. Dr. Cole and I maintained our professional friendship, and he occasionally joined our group activities, his presence a quiet statement that Derek's accusations had been lies that no one believed. The pediatric ward felt like a place where goodness still existed, where people fought for vulnerable children with fierce dedication and compassion. 6 months after the courthouse conviction, I received an unexpected letter forwarded through Richard's office. It was from Derek, written from jail, and Richard had screened it first to make sure it contained nothing threatening or inappropriate before passing it along to me. He advised me that I had no obligation to read it, that I could simply destroy it if I preferred. I stared at the envelope for 3 days before finally opening it, curious despite myself about what Derek could possibly have to say. The letter was strange, a mixture of self-pity and what seemed like genuine attempts at self-reflection. Derek wrote about the anger management classes he was taking, the therapy sessions he was required to attend, the conversations with other inmates that had supposedly opened his eyes to patterns in his behavior. He claimed to understand now that he had been controlling and manipulative long before the wedding, that the violence at the altar was just the most visible manifestation of tendencies he had been feeding for years. He apologized, though the apology felt hollow and self-serving, more about his need to feel like he was working toward redemption than about my healing. He talked about his childhood, a father who was emotionally abusive, a mother who enabled toxic behavior, patterns he had supposedly never recognized until now. He expressed hope that someday I might forgive him, not for his sake but for my own peace. The whole thing read like someone following a template from a recovery program rather than genuine remorse from the heart. I showed the letter to Patricia in our next therapy session, and we dissected it together. She pointed out the ways Derek still centered himself in the narrative, how even his apology was really about his journey and growth rather than acknowledging the harm he had caused me. She helped me see that I didn't owe Derek forgiveness, that healing didn't require extending grace to someone who had hurt me so profoundly. Forgiveness, if it came at all, would be for my benefit on my timeline, not because Derek had written a letter from jail expressing regret. I wrote a response that I never sent, a cathartic exercise Patricia suggested. In it, I told Derek exactly what I thought of his apology, how his patterns of manipulation extended even into his attempt to make amends. I wrote about the ongoing impact of his violence, the nightmares and hypervigilance and difficulty trusting anyone. I wrote about watching his company collapse and feeling nothing, about donating his settlement money to help other women escape situations like the one I had barely avoided. And I wrote that I hoped he truly did change, not for my sake but for any future woman who might cross his path, so that his violence ended with me. Writing that letter and then burning it in my kitchen sink felt like a ritual of release. Watching the paper curl and blacken, the words disappearing into ash, I felt something shift inside me. Derek's opinion of me, his version of events, his attempts at redemption, none of it mattered anymore. He had become irrelevant to my life except as a lesson learned, a chapter closed, a cautionary tale about trusting charm over character. Work provided unexpected opportunities for growth. Patricia, my supervisor at the hospital, approached me about a position on a committee developing protocols for identifying and assisting patients in abusive situations. Healthcare providers were often the first line of defense in recognizing domestic violence, but many lacked training in how to approach the topic sensitively or what resources to offer. My experience, combined with my nursing expertise, made me uniquely qualified to contribute to this initiative. I threw myself into the committee work, researching best practices from hospitals across the country, consulting with domestic violence experts, developing training materials for staff. We created pocket cards with warning signs and local resources, implemented screening questions that could be asked during routine appointments, established partnerships with shelters and legal aid organizations. It felt powerful to transform my trauma into something that might help others, to take the worst experience of my life and use it to create systemic change. The committee work led to speaking opportunities. I was invited to present at a nursing conference about recognizing abuse in relationships, and despite my terror at public speaking, I accepted. Standing on that stage talking about my experience to a room full of healthcare professionals felt vulnerable and empowering in equal measure. I showed the wedding video, which still made me flinch to watch, and used it as a teaching moment about how abuse often escalates at major life transitions like weddings, pregnancies, or moves. The response was overwhelming. Nurses came up to me afterwards sharing their own stories, some as survivors and some as providers who had missed signs in their patients. Several asked if I would be willing to speak at their hospitals or community organizations. What had started as a single presentation turned into a regular part of my life, a second career running parallel to my nursing work. I wasn't a professional speaker or an expert with credentials, just someone who had survived and was willing to share that survival with others. Lauren, ever supportive, helped me develop a simple website where people could request speaking engagements or access resources. She designed it beautifully, with testimonials from the support group members who had heard my story, information about the domestic violence organizations I supported, and links to hotlines and shelters. It wasn't about building a brand or becoming famous, it was about creating a resource that might help someone recognize they were in danger or give them courage to leave. My dating life remained non-existent, and I was okay with that. The thought of trusting someone romantically felt impossible, and therapy had taught me that I needed to heal thoroughly before even considering opening my heart again. Well-meaning friends occasionally tried to set me up, insisting that the best way to get over Derek was to meet someone new, but I firmly declined. I was learning to be alone without being lonely, to enjoy my own company, to build a life that felt full and meaningful without a romantic partner. There were hard days, moments when the trauma felt fresh despite the passage of time. Certain triggers would send me spiraling, a raised voice in the hospital hallway, a man who moved too quickly in my peripheral vision, the sight of a couple getting married on a television show. I learned to recognize these moments, to practice the grounding techniques Patricia had taught me, to reach out to my support system when I needed help. Healing wasn't linear, and accepting that truth made the difficult days more bearable. The 1-year anniversary of the wedding that never was approached with strange inevitability. I had been dreading it, anticipating that the date would bring up painful memories and complicated emotions. Instead, Lauren organized what she called an Independence Day celebration, gathering our closest friends at her apartment for an evening of food and laughter and gratitude. We toasted to survival, to growth, to the future that spread out before me full of possibility now that I was free from Derek's influence. During that gathering, Hannah pulled me aside and told me something that made me cry for the first time in months. She said that watching me survive and rebuild had changed her fundamentally, had taught her to value her own strength and trust her instincts. She said I had become her hero, not because I was perfect or fearless, but because I had faced something terrible and chosen to grow from it rather than letting it destroy me. Her words felt like a gift, acknowledgement that my pain had meaning beyond just my own experience. As autumn arrived again, the season that should have marked my first anniversary as Derek's wife, I found myself reflecting on how much had changed. I was genuinely happy, a deep contentment that came from living authentically rather than performing a role. My work at the hospital remained fulfilling, the committee initiatives were creating real change, and my speaking engagements were helping people recognize abuse before it escalated to violence. I had friends who truly knew me, family relationships that had deepened, and a growing sense of purpose that extended beyond my own healing. Derek's jail sentence was nearing its end, and I knew he would be released soon to begin his probation period. Richard had assured me that the restraining order would remain in effect, that Derek was legally prohibited from contacting me in any way. Still, the knowledge of his impending release created a low-level anxiety that I worked through with Patricia. We discussed safety planning, what to do if Derek violated the order, how to maintain my peace while acknowledging realistic concerns. I learned through mutual acquaintances that Derek had moved back in with his parents after being released, that he was working a regular job for the first time since college, that his life had been reduced to something small and manageable. Part of me felt vindicated knowing that his violence had cost him everything he valued, his company, his reputation, his freedom. But mostly I felt nothing, an absence of emotion that seemed healthy rather than cold. He simply didn't matter to me anymore except as a reminder of lessons learned and strength discovered. The support group had become a cornerstone of my life, a weekly reminder that I wasn't alone in my experience or my healing. I had watched women enter broken and leave whole, had witnessed transformations that seemed impossible at the start. I had also watched women struggle and relapse into old patterns, returning to abusive partners despite knowing better. Those situations hurt, but they taught me that healing required readiness, that you couldn't save someone who wasn't ready to save themselves. I started mentoring newer members of the group, offering the kind of guidance that Patricia had given me when I first arrived. Sitting across from a woman whose eyes held the same confusion and shame I remembered feeling, I could offer hope rooted in evidence. I was proof that life continued after trauma, that joy was possible again, that the person who hurt you didn't get to write the ending of your story. Those conversations felt sacred, moments of genuine connection between people who understood pain that others could only theorize about. The seasons changed and with them came a version of myself I barely recognized from 2 years earlier. Spring arrived with cherry blossoms and longer days, and I found myself genuinely excited about the future in a way that felt foreign after so long living in survival mode. The hospital committee had expanded its domestic violence awareness program to 3 other medical centers in the region, and I was being asked to train their staff on implementation. What had started as a personal healing project had grown into something that touched hundreds of healthcare workers and potentially thousands of patients. My speaking engagements had evolved beyond nursing conferences into broader audiences. Universities invited me to talk to students about healthy relationships and recognizing red flags. Corporate human resources departments brought me in to discuss workplace harassment and supporting employees in crisis. Community centers asked me to lead workshops for parents on teaching their teenagers about respect and consent. Each presentation forced me to refine my message, to find ways of sharing my story that educated without sensationalizing, that empowered without minimizing the real dangers women faced. The financial stability from the settlement and my speaking fees allowed me to cut back slightly on hospital shifts, giving me time to pursue other interests I had neglected during my relationship with Derek. I took a pottery class at the community center where the support group met, finding unexpected joy in working with clay, in creating something beautiful with my hands. The tactile nature of the work, the way throwing a pot required complete presence and focus, became a form of meditation that quieted the remaining anxious voices in my head. Lauren had started dating someone seriously, a kind man named Michael who worked as a teacher and treated her with genuine respect and affection. Watching their relationship develop, seeing what healthy love actually looked like, provided a roadmap I hadn't known I was missing. They communicated openly, resolved conflicts without raised voices or manipulation, supported each other's individual growth while building something together. It was simple and ordinary and absolutely revolutionary compared to what I had experienced with Derek. Being around their relationship stirred complicated feelings. Happiness for Lauren mixed with grief for what I had missed out on, hope that I might find something similar someday tangled with fear that I would never be able to trust someone enough to try again. Patricia helped me work through these emotions in therapy, reminding me that healing didn't mean never feeling pain, it meant having tools to process pain without being destroyed by it. She also gently suggested that my resistance to dating might be less about trauma and more about genuinely enjoying my independence, and that both were valid choices. The second anniversary of the wedding approached with far less dread than the first. I had planned a solo trip to the coast, wanting to mark the occasion in solitude and reflection rather than celebration or mourning. I rented a small cottage overlooking the ocean, bringing books and journals and art supplies, giving myself a week of complete disconnection from responsibilities and expectations. The sound of waves became a constant soundtrack, and I spent hours walking the beach, watching the water transform the sand, thinking about impermanence and resilience. During one of those long walks, I encountered an older woman throwing pottery shards into the surf. She explained that she collected broken ceramics from thrift stores and gave them back to the ocean, a ritual she had started after her divorce 30 years earlier. We talked for over an hour about transformation and letting go, about how breaking isn't always destruction but sometimes necessary deconstruction before rebuilding. She gave me a piece of pale blue pottery, worn smooth by time and water, and told me to keep it as a reminder that broken things can become beautiful in new ways. I carried that pottery shard in my pocket for weeks afterward, touching it during difficult moments, remembering our conversation when I felt stuck or discouraged. It became a talisman of sorts, physical proof that pain can be transmuted into something meaningful, that endings are always simultaneously beginnings if you're willing to see them that way. I placed it on my bathroom windowsill where I would see it every morning, a small anchor point connecting me to the journey I had traveled. Work at the hospital brought an unexpected opportunity that forced me to confront how much I had actually healed. A pharmaceutical company representative came through the pediatric ward, and something about his confidence and charisma immediately reminded me of Derek. The same easy smile, the same ability to command attention, the same polished exterior that could hide anything underneath. I felt my chest tighten and my breathing shallow, classic anxiety response to a perceived threat. But instead of fleeing or shutting down, I was able to observe the reaction, recognize it as a trauma response rather than actual danger, and move through it. After he left, I sat in the break room processing what had happened. My body had reacted to similarity rather than genuine threat, an important distinction that showed both how much work I still had to do and how far I had come. 2 years ago, I might have spiraled into a full panic attack. Instead, I had experienced discomfort, acknowledged it, and continued functioning. Patricia would be proud, I thought, and made a note to discuss it in our next session. The support group had become more than just a weekly meeting, evolving into a network of women who supported each other through all aspects of life, not just trauma recovery. We celebrated promotions and new apartments, attended each other's kids' birthday parties, showed up when someone needed help moving or a ride to a medical appointment. The shared experience of surviving abuse had created bonds that felt unbreakable, a chosen family that understood each other on a fundamental level. One member named Teresa asked me to speak at her daughter's high school about recognizing unhealthy relationships. The thought of talking to teenagers felt daunting in a different way than speaking to adults. They were at the age where romance seemed exciting and dangerous behavior could be mistaken for passion. I spent days preparing, wanting to strike the right balance between warning and empowerment, between sharing my story and respecting their intelligence and agency. The high school presentation surprised me with its impact. The students asked thoughtful questions that revealed how much they already understood about manipulation and control, often from personal experience or observation. Several came up afterward to share their own stories or concerns about friends in troubling relationships. Their vulnerability and trust moved me deeply, and I left promising to return for follow-up workshops. The school counselor told me they had never seen students so engaged with a prevention program, and asked if I would consider developing a curriculum they could implement more broadly. That request sparked an idea that had been percolating for months. What if I formalized my speaking and training into an actual organization, a nonprofit dedicated to domestic violence education and prevention? I could reach more people, create sustainable programs, maybe even hire other survivors who wanted to turn their experiences into advocacy work. The thought was simultaneously thrilling and terrifying, requiring a level of commitment and visibility I wasn't sure I was ready for. I discussed the idea with everyone in my inner circle, seeking perspectives and concerns. My parents were supportive but worried about the emotional toll of immersing myself so deeply in trauma work. Lauren thought it was brilliant but cautioned me not to lose sight of my own healing in the process of helping others. Hannah offered to help with social media and marketing, her background in communications perfectly suited to building an organization from scratch. Richard volunteered to handle the legal paperwork for establishing a nonprofit, refusing to charge his usual fees for work he considered a public service. The decision crystallized one evening at the support group when a new member shared her story. She described years of escalating abuse that started exactly the way mine had, with charm and intensity that felt like love but was actually possession. She talked about missing red flags because she didn't know what to look for, about staying because she believed his apologies and promises to change. Listening to her, I realized that education was the most powerful tool for prevention. If we could teach people what healthy relationships looked like, how to recognize manipulation and control, maybe we could stop abuse before it escalated to violence. I filed the paperwork to establish the nonprofit the following week. Finding a name took days of brainstorming with Lauren and Hannah, rejecting options that felt too clinical or too soft, searching for something that captured both the pain and the power of survival. We finally settled on Rise Again Foundation, simple and hopeful, conveying both the fall and the recovery. The logo featured a phoenix, obvious symbolism perhaps but effective, suggesting transformation and rebirth from ashes. Building the organization consumed my spare time in the best possible way. I developed a comprehensive curriculum covering everything from identifying red flags in early dating to safely leaving abusive situations to rebuilding life after trauma. I created training modules for different audiences, schools and workplaces and healthcare settings and law enforcement. I recruited other survivors from the support group who wanted to share their stories, training them in public speaking and self-care practices to prevent re-traumatization. The first official Rise Again workshop happened at a community college 6 months after filing the nonprofit paperwork. 30 people attended, mostly young women but also a few men and older adults seeking to understand abuse dynamics better. I was nervous in a way I hadn't been since my first speaking engagement, feeling the weight of responsibility for this organization I had created. But once I started talking, the familiar rhythm took over, and I fell into the flow of sharing knowledge and experience in ways that resonated with the audience. The feedback forums afterward were overwhelmingly positive, with many attendees saying the workshop had changed how they viewed their own relationships or gave them tools to help friends they were worried about. Several people approached me wanting to volunteer with the organization, offering skills in grant writing and website development and social media management. What had been essentially a one-woman operation began growing into something with real infrastructure and sustainability. Funding proved challenging in ways I hadn't fully anticipated. Grant applications required extensive documentation and reporting, consuming hours of administrative work that took away from direct service. I hired a part-time grant writer named Susan who had experience with nonprofit development, and her expertise immediately made a difference. Within 3 months, we had secured several small grants that covered basic operational costs and allowed me to offer workshops for free or sliding scale fees. The hospital administration approached me about bringing Rise Again programming into their employee wellness initiatives, offering both funding and institutional support. It felt full circle, this place that had been my sanctuary during the worst period of my life now becoming a partner in the work I had built from that pain. We developed a specialized program for healthcare workers, addressing the unique stresses and trauma exposure that made them vulnerable to unhealthy relationships while also training them to better support patients experiencing abuse. Media attention for Rise Again came unexpectedly when a local news station ran a feature on innovative domestic violence prevention programs. The segment included footage from one of my workshops and an interview where I spoke about founding the organization. The story went regional, then national, picked up by outlets looking for positive examples of survivors creating change. My inbox exploded with requests for interviews, speaking engagements, and collaboration opportunities from organizations across the country. The visibility was both gratifying and overwhelming. On one hand, it meant reaching more people, spreading awareness, building partnerships that could amplify our impact. On the other hand, it meant less privacy, more scrutiny, and the constant risk of being reduced to my trauma rather than seen as a whole person. I had to learn boundaries around media engagement, when to say yes to opportunities and when to protect my energy and well-being by declining. One particularly difficult request came from a documentary filmmaker who wanted to tell my story as part of a series on domestic violence survivors. She had obtained footage of the wedding video and wanted to use it as the centerpiece of an episode about public incidents of abuse. The thought of that video being broadcast again, analyzed and discussed and viewed by potentially millions of people, made me physically ill. I declined as gracefully as possible, explaining that while I supported her project, I needed some aspects of my experience to remain private. The filmmaker was disappointed but understanding, and her graciousness reminded me that I could set boundaries even around advocacy work. Just because I had chosen to speak publicly about my experience didn't mean I owed anyone access to every detail or artifact of my trauma. The wedding video would always exist, circulating online beyond my control, but I didn't have to participate in amplifying it further. That distinction felt important, a line between using my story to help others and allowing my story to consume my entire identity. Derek surfaced occasionally in indirect ways that reminded me he still existed in the world. I heard through former mutual acquaintances that he had completed his probation and was working a corporate job far below his previous status. Someone mentioned seeing him at a coffee shop looking tired and ordinary, nothing like the confident man who had once commanded rooms with his presence. These glimpses of his diminished life stirred no particular emotion in me, neither satisfaction nor pity, just a distant acknowledgement that his path and mine had permanently diverged. The restraining order had expired after 2 years, legally allowing Derek to contact me if he chose, though Richard had made it clear that any attempt to do so would be viewed as harassment and pursued aggressively. Derek apparently understood this, maintaining the distance that I desperately needed. The absence of any attempt to reach out actually helped my healing more than continued legal barriers might have, proof that I truly didn't occupy his thoughts the way he no longer occupied mine. Therapy with Patricia evolved into less frequent sessions as I needed less intensive support. We moved from weekly to bi-weekly to monthly check-ins, acknowledging that while I would likely always carry some effects from the trauma, I had developed robust coping mechanisms and a strong support system. Patricia said I was one of her success stories, though she cautioned that healing wasn't linear and I might need more intensive support again during stressful periods or unexpected triggers. My relationship with my family had settled into a comfortable new normal. Sunday dinners at my parents' house became a weekly tradition, often including Lauren and Michael and Hannah's new boyfriend. We talked about everything except Derek unless I brought him up, respecting my need to not have my trauma be the constant center of conversation. My father had stopped asking if I was dating, finally accepting that I might be genuinely content single rather than just scared of trying again. Hannah had become involved with Rise Again, using her marketing skills to build our social media presence and donor base. She had a gift for storytelling that made people care about our mission, for creating content that educated while inspiring action. Our collaboration strengthened our relationship even further, giving us shared purpose beyond family connection. She sometimes joked that surviving my almost wedding had given her a career path she never would have imagined, turning family trauma into a force for positive change. The pottery classes continued to provide creative outlet and meditation, and I had progressed enough to start selling pieces at a local artisan market. Nothing fancy, simple bowls and mugs glazed in ocean colors that reminded me of that cottage by the sea. The money was negligible, but the satisfaction of creating something beautiful, of seeing people connect with objects I had made with my hands, filled a space I hadn't known was empty. Some customers became repeat buyers, and I started taking custom orders for special occasions. One Saturday at the market, a woman approached my table and stared at me for a long moment before speaking. She asked if I was the Claire from the viral wedding video, and my stomach dropped in the familiar way it always did when strangers recognized me from the worst moment of my life. But then she started crying, thanking me for being so strong, for pressing charges, for speaking out. She said watching my response to Derek's violence had given her courage to leave her own abusive marriage, that seeing someone stand up in that moment had shown her it was possible to demand better treatment. We talked for over an hour, her sharing her story of escape and rebuilding while other market customers browsed and occasionally interrupted with questions about pottery. By the end of our conversation, I had given her information about Rise Again and she had bought 3 of my bowls, 1 for herself and 2 for the therapist and lawyer who had helped her leave. After she walked away, I sat at my table feeling the weight of impact in a way I never had before. My worst day had become part of someone else's catalyst for positive change, connection between strangers united by survival. That encounter reinforced why the advocacy work mattered despite its emotional cost. Every workshop reached people whose names I would never know, whose stories I would never hear, who might take one piece of information and use it to recognize danger or find safety or support someone they loved. The ripple effects were immeasurable and ongoing, spreading outward in ways I couldn't track or control but could trust were happening. Rise Again's first anniversary came with a celebration that felt surreal. We had served over 500 people directly through workshops and training, partnered with 15 organizations across 3 states, and raised enough money to hire 2 part-time staff members in addition to Susan. The growth had been exponential and somewhat overwhelming, requiring systems and structure I was still learning to build. But standing in front of the room full of volunteers and board members and community partners, I felt profound gratitude for what we had created together from the wreckage of my almost wedding. 3 years after the wedding that never happened, I found myself standing in front of a mirror in a courthouse, straightening my blazer before giving testimony in a legislative hearing. Rise Again had been invited to provide expert perspective on a proposed bill that would strengthen protections for domestic violence survivors and mandate prevention education in schools. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was back in a legal setting, but this time as an advocate rather than a victim, using my voice to create systemic change rather than simply seeking personal justice. The testimony went well, and several legislators approached me afterward expressing support for the bill and admiration for the work Rise Again had accomplished. One representative asked if I would be willing to serve on a statewide task force examining domestic violence prevention strategies, and I accepted immediately despite not knowing exactly what that would entail. Each new opportunity felt like evidence that I had successfully transformed pain into purpose, that Derek's violence had not defined my story but had instead catalyzed a mission larger than myself. Walking out of the courthouse into bright sunshine, I checked my phone and found a message from Lauren. She was engaged to Michael, and she wanted me to be her maid of honor. The request filled me with joy untainted by any lingering grief about my own failed wedding. I had reached a place where other people's happiness didn't trigger my trauma, where weddings were celebrations rather than reminders of what I had lost. That emotional freedom felt like the final piece of healing clicking into place. My personal life had expanded in unexpected directions. I had started casually dating, nothing serious but enough to prove to myself that I could trust again, that not every man was hiding darkness behind charm. There was a teacher named Ben who I saw occasionally, someone kind and patient who respected my boundaries without making me feel broken. We took things slowly, building friendship before romance, and while I didn't know if it would develop into something lasting, the possibility no longer terrified me. The support group had evolved with several members graduating to monthly check-ins rather than weekly attendance. Their healing progressed enough that they no longer needed constant reinforcement. New members continued arriving, and I had trained other women to facilitate so the group could continue whether I was present or not. Watching the community sustain itself independent of my involvement felt like proof that healing was contagious, that strength could be passed from one survivor to another in an endless chain of resilience. Rise Again had grown beyond anything I imagined that day I filed the nonprofit paperwork. We now had a full-time staff of 5, an active volunteer base of over 40 people, and partnerships with organizations in 12 states. The curriculum I developed had been adopted by 3 school districts and 2 major hospital systems. We had trained over 2,000 people in recognizing and responding to domestic violence, reaching an estimated 50,000 people indirectly through those trained individuals. The pottery had become more than a hobby, evolving into a small business that provided both income and artistic fulfillment. I had a standing arrangement with 3 local shops that carried my pieces, and I did custom work for weddings and special events. The symbolism of creating beautiful functional objects from shapeless clay never lost its resonance, each piece a reminder that transformation was always possible with patience and the right tools. My relationship with forgiveness had shifted in ways I never expected. I hadn't forgiven Derek for hitting me, might never forgive that specific act of violence. But I had released the anger and bitterness that once consumed me, not for his benefit but for my own peace. He simply didn't occupy space in my emotional landscape anymore. When I thought of him at all, it was with the distant curiosity you might feel about a stranger whose choices led them down a very different path from your own. The anniversary of the almost wedding no longer felt significant. It had become just another day in September rather than a marker of trauma or transformation. That ordinariness felt like victory, proof that I had integrated the experience into my life story without letting it dominate every chapter. I could acknowledge what happened without being controlled by it, could use the lessons learned without remaining trapped in the pain of learning them. Standing at the edge of another autumn, I thought about the woman who had walked down that aisle 3 years earlier, believing she knew what her life would look like, confident in choices that were about to explode spectacularly. I felt compassion for her naivety but also gratitude for her strength, for the way she had responded in that crucial moment when everything fell apart. That Claire had made decisions that created the life I now lived, and while I wouldn't choose to repeat the experience, I couldn't regret where it had ultimately led me. The future stretched out full of possibility rather than predetermined scripts. I didn't know if I would marry someday or remain contentedly single. I didn't know how large Rise Again would grow or what new directions the work might take. I didn't know what other challenges or joys waited around corners I hadn't reached yet. But I knew with absolute certainty that I could handle whatever came, that I had been tested in ways most people never face and had emerged not just intact but stronger. The wedding that never happened had taught me more about myself than any marriage could have. It had revealed strength I didn't know I possessed, connected me with a community of survivors who understood pain that others could only theorize about, and given me purpose that extended far beyond my individual healing. Derek had tried to break me in front of 200 witnesses, but instead he had shown me exactly who I was capable of becoming when pushed past every imagined limit. That realization, that Derek's worst moment had catalyzed my best self, felt like the ultimate form of justice. He had given me a story worth telling, and I had chosen to tell it in ways that helped others rather than simply dwelling in victimhood. The viral video of his violence would always exist, but it would be forever overshadowed by the work I had built from its ashes, by the lives touched and changed through Rise Again, by the proof that survival could be beautiful even when the surviving was ugly. I was Claire Donovan, survivor and advocate, potter and speaker, friend and sister and daughter. I was someone who had been slapped at her wedding and had responded by building an organization that protected others from similar violence. I was living proof that the worst thing that ever happens to you doesn't have to be the most important thing, that you can take trauma and transmute it into something that serves the world. And I was, finally and fully, genuinely okay. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.